Hey Dave, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Nick. How are you?
Not too bad for podcasting on a Monday.
Podcasting on a Monday, it just feels wrong. We'll make the most of it. We'll make the most of it.
That's right. Summer's back with a vengeance here in Michigan, so one last
Yes.
blast before everybody goes back to their normal lives around here, right?
Yep. Yep. I'll be hiding in my basement this afternoon, most likely.
So the best part of having a Monday podcast is we can just tee it up to the new guy around here to do all
Yeah.
the heavy lifting, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We have our very own Cole Williams, our newest associate advisor, on with us today, and going to talk about changes in the housing market. We've been dealing with inflation and talking about inflation kind of at large for a long time now. We're going to get specific here a little bit.
Yeah. So welcome to the show, Cole. Tell us, tell us all we need to know about housing.
Yeah.
Everything about housing. Yeah, well, first of all, it's good to be back. I think this is my first appearance since the intern podcast that we
Yeah.
did a few months ago. So sticking around for a while, see how it works out. But yeah, so getting into housing, as you guys mentioned, obviously inflation has been kind of the one of the big topics of conversation, not only in the world of personal finance, but kind of just in the world writ large for the last few years. And it's definitely had a pretty meaningful impact on the housing market, as anybody who is buying and selling is no doubt aware of. So, what I wanted to get into today was talking about not only the current standing in the market, but trying to kind of compare it to previous housing markets of the past,
Mhm.
and really looking at kind of the relationship between interest rates today and interest rates going back to kind of the 70s and 80s, the Carter and the Reagan
Yeah.
administrations.
And the
So I think
last time we
there's a
dealt
lot
with
of,
inflation like
yeah,
this.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So one of the really interesting things, kind of comparing the two eras, is one, the National Association of Realtors pretty consistently puts out a poll, basically just asking people, do you think it's a good time to buy a house? So
Hmm.
in September of 85, where I believe interest rates were either between 15 and 18%, 72% of consumers said it was actually a good time to buy, which is extremely interesting because we're sitting right around like 6, 7, 8%, somewhere in there, depending upon your FICO. And it's only 12% of people said it's a good time to buy in June of this year.
Right.
So you look at that, and obviously we have a really stark contrast in the affordability of these loans. But what's interesting is that we really didn't have an inventory problem in the 80s.
Mm.
Today, we have
Hmm.
higher interest rates, even though they're kind of more so at a historical norm today than they have been over the last 15. We'll get into that.
Good point.
But we have higher interest rates today, but lower interest rates, significantly lower than from the mid 80s. And only 12% of people think it's a good time to buy a house, largely because over the last 4 or 5 years, the average cost of a home in the country has increased by about 50%.
Yes. Yeah. Big
Yeah,
jump in prices.
super interesting dynamic where only 12% of people think that it's a good time to buy a house, and yet housing prices keep going up.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you know,
Well,
still supply and demand. Economics still apply, right?
it really does get to the heart of the issue. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's extremely interesting, and what it's also done is that when you look at kind of I mean, it's a little cliche to talk about, like the boomers now, but truthfully, when you're looking at the late 70s, mid 80s, it was a lot of the baby boomer generation that was looking to become first time homebuyers, and in 1984, the average age of a first time home buyer was 29 years old, and today it's 36. So it
Wow.
really is
Wow.
delaying home ownership significantly for
Hmm.
a lot of Americans. And as you guys definitely no doubt know, for many, many decades now, home ownership has really been promoted as kind of the American dream. It's the
Hmm.
bedrock of wealth for most families. And
Hmm.
Yes.
so I think that it's going to be interesting as we progress to see how that's really going to impact American personal finances moving forward.
Yeah, I think that last part about like how it has been seen as like the way to wealth is very interesting. Obviously, we talk about it a lot on this show. We deal with a lot of retirees, but like there's this dynamic of like, hey, I have to own a house, right? And like in
Mhm.
especially even in retirement, of like, a lot of people sold their house because they didn't need it for various reasons, but they still have this pull of like, I should own something, right?
Right.
And it obviously drives some of the market factors as well. But as I'm sure you're going to share with us here, is like, maybe maybe that's not such, maybe that's not really the way to think about things now, right?
Yeah, it definitely is, and this obviously fluctuates as housing markets move. But so I did just a basic little study according to bank rates. So in February of this past year, Redfin basically did an average cost of a house in the United States of America, and it was around $413,000. Which, if you're buying the average home at the average interest rate that you would get at that time, it would be your monthly payment would be about $2,700. Whereas the
Mhm.
typical rent in a lot of those same areas and cities that they were covering was about $2,000. So it's about $700 cheaper per month to rent, kind of in this immediate moment that we are in, as opposed to home ownership. Now, obviously, there's a much broader discussion to that because it's, in theory at least, you're building equity in a home. You're eventually going to get to the point where you do own a home. So your housing costs, your monthly housing costs are going to go down, probably more like in retirement. But if you are somebody who's, let's say, in their 20s or 30s, you're interested in eventually owning a home, but you're also trying to kind of balance that with investing, putting into your 401k, putting into a Roth, things like that to develop your portfolio over time. It can be a great way or a good time to rent, to kind of allocate that $700 on
Mhm.
average to saving for the down payments and or to be, investing.
So I'm curious about your numbers here.
Hmm.
So the 2,700 is just for principal and interest on the mortgage, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So that doesn't include insuring your house or paying the
Taxes.
taxes.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
upkeep.
Or,
Or
and yeah,
upkeep.
that's the
Yep.
other thing, like upkeep,
Yeah.
right?
Yep. Yeah,
It's
no, it is, and it obviously doesn't necessarily hold true for all American cities. I think it's like
Oh,
Detroit and
sure.
Philadelphia are obviously a lot cheaper than San Francisco and Manhattan, but
Yeah.
Mhm.
but it's yeah, that's so true. There's so many different hidden costs to home ownership,
Hmm.
and I guess the counterpoint to that as well is that if you are a landlord, you're not going to eat the hidden costs of homeownership. I mean, to an extent you
Right.
are,
Mhm.
but usually you're factoring that rent or those costs into your rent.
Right.
Sure.
You're also boxed into, you exist in a market with other landlords, and you can't just, if
Mm.
you can't charge rent that is competitive in the market, then you can't,
Right.
survive.
You can't function.
So
Right.
exactly, exactly.
Well, I'm no expert in this, but I have to assume that rental rates, haven't really gone up as fast because those people all have loans of, lower amounts. So like
Yeah.
their costs haven't gone up as quickly as like going out right now and buying a house, right? Does that make sense what I'm
Yes.
saying?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
100% true. And that's really what's also contributing to the inventory problem in a lot of
Hmm.
ways is obviously 2020 and 2021. There's, all of the stimulus money that's being flushed in. We have 0% interest rates. Everybody's trying to buy a house. I mean, I've heard so many people or so many stories of people buying like lakefront property and homes without even
Mhm.
walking through the house, just like,
Yeah.
sure, like give
Yeah.
it to me, whatever it
It
needs
was
to be.
pretty silly. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty ridiculous. But you have a lot of people who have locked in these essentially below inflation rate mortgages, who obviously don't have any interest in selling their home and taking on a 7% mortgage now.
Right.
So not only do we not have enough new builds, but we also don't have enough people who would normally be in the interest of buying and selling homes and changing locations, things like that. So we just really have a significant inventory problem if you are looking to buy a home.
Well, and I'm sure there's probably a study out there somewhere, but we live in a world where the housing market changed a little bit with the Airbnb and VRBO coming on board,
Mhm.
right? Like all of a sudden, there's a new gateway of like, hey, let's buy multiple houses. We can do short-term rentals as
Yes.
well. which causes even more inventory problems, right? Because you have people wanting to invest in a second property that probably normally wouldn't do it if it wasn't so easy to rent out on a short-term basis.
Yeah, and I mean, also kind of it's a political talking point at this point too. But there have been in recent years pushes by larger, I guess it's mainly like investment banks and hedge funds to
Private equity.
buy up, yeah, private equities to buy up single family homes in order to rent them. I mean, it's a great way for
Hmm.
them to diversify their own portfolios into the real estate market. But when they're able to bid and buy those homes at a premium because they can, then that
Hmm.
also will naturally price out a lot of everyday consumers out of the market as well.
Yeah, from their point of view, financial crisis notwithstanding, it's a pretty good bet. People tend to pay their rents and pay their
Yeah,
mortgages
Yeah.
fairly consistently. So housing is a good bet, and it's not a it seems to me a big part of the problem is that the supply is somewhat inelastic,
Yeah.
right? And we saw this huge collapse in homes being built, particularly what would be considered starter homes and or homes that baby boomers would want to downsize to
Yep.
in exchange for the 36 to 4600 square foot you know 3-story McMansions in the suburbs where they can
right.
make more margin. And yeah, it's hard to fix a supply problem in housing overnight.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and going on to the building aspect of it as well, I actually found a little bit of data on that as well. So, last year there were about 1.4 million new housing units that were built, and compared with
Hmm.
1.7 in 1985. And also, when you're looking at the prefab manufactured homes, I believe it was last year was only about 90,000 of those were created, as opposed to 280,000 in 85. So we have
Right.
more people now, and we have significantly less housing that was being built 40 years ago.
Hmm.
I should have pulled these statistics up, but I read an article in the Wall Street Journal back in like January or February that pretty much summed it up as when you adjust it for population growth, we have essentially built a million too few homes every year since 2010.
Yeah,
Yeah.
About
yeah.
what it worked out to be. That's
Which,
a lot of houses.
to contrast, I will say for many of our clients who are retirees, who
Hmm.
many of them do own their homes, the flip side to that is if you bought a home in 1985 and if you still own that home to this day, you've likely
Yes.
seen significant price appreciation over that period of time.
Yes. Yes.
So if you are a retiree who has any interest in potentially downsizing, in a weird way, your house kind of has probably become a bit of a financial asset for you, even though people reference a house as a financial asset a lot of the time. But I know I've talked to Nick
Yeah.
about this a lot off air. Is that it is, but you still have to live somewhere. So in
Right.
theory, it isn't like Coca-Cola stock where you can just cash it in.
Well,
But many people are in a weird spot where they have built up a ton of equity in their house.
this is anecdotal, just talking to clients and trying to solve these kind of problems. Though it's, I guess the best way to put it is the problem I'm seeing is that a baby boomer who wants to downsize at this point, pay, their house that they bought in 1985 has appreciated and valuable and been a good investment, but the price per square foot, I guess if you will, to downsize, it's like they're not gaining anything financially
Mm,
because the price for that single level house with accessibility built into it is higher per square foot or however you want to express that than their current house, even though they've made good value on it over the years, good investment return.
yeah,
So financially, it's not easy to downsize.
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, we've seen that a lot in terms of like, yes, you could sell your house, you make a lot of money on it, but then you got to turn around and buy a new house with a higher
Right.
mortgage, and you're basically downsizing, and it's costing you more money to do it,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
why
Yeah.
would I go smaller if it's not going to say,
Yeah.
if it's more expensive to do so?
Yeah. You're not gaining what you should gain in a more normalized supply environment, I guess
Right.
is the
Yeah, for
the way
sure.
to put that.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So
But
it's I'd like to go back a little bit too. We touched on it a little bit, but like just the cost of home ownership, because
Hmm.
fixing up your house, getting new additions, all that stuff is more and more expensive. And one thing, and when you look at it from the standpoint of like, is owning a house a good investment compared to renting, right? Like, everybody sees it that way, but I have yet to meet anybody that like actually year by year categories their maintenance costs, adds them
Hmm.
all up at the end, how much money they put into fixing up their house, adds that up. Like nobody does that. So it's really hard to tell, like, was it a good investment or not? If you
Right.
just look on paper, like, hey, we made $100,000 when we sold our house after 10 years. Well, it probably cost you close to that just keeping it up and paying all the different, all the things that
I
go into it.
had some interesting talks with folks that have sold in the last year because, for one thing, with all the growth they've seen, all of a sudden capital gains were on the radar when they weren't rolling those gains necessarily into a new house.
Right.
And it was interesting to go back and say, well, okay, you've owned that house for 35, 40 years. How many roofs have you done? How many,
Yeah.
driveways have, and, and all of a sudden, that light bulb starts to go on that, yeah, I have really spent a lot of, it's not all pure investment gain when it comes down to it.
Right.
You
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then there's kind of the academic side of it too, whereas we're talking about definitely currently, on average, it's significantly cheaper to rent in most cities than it is to own. But there's the human element of it where are people who are renting, how many of them are conscious or aware of the fact or are disciplined enough with money
Mhm.
to take that excess money that you would potentially be
Yes,
putting towards homeownership and actually to be kind of doing something productive with it.
Sure.
And I do think
yeah,
that part of what homeownership does in a way is it provides a built-in savings element for most Americans who
exactly.
don't probably aren't that great at budgeting, probably aren't that great at kind of staying on top of where all of their money is going or investing. And it's just a good way to like kind of accidentally wake up one day and you own a $500,000 house, it's because you just
Yeah.
kept paying your
No,
mortgage.
no, you're
So,
you're you're absolutely right, and that goes back to the end of the Great Depression and government decisions right along those lines. That promoting the idea of home ownership and providing tax incentives and different boosts along the way were the key to growing the middle class. And it's interesting because I kind of feel like it's an ongoing experiment that won't be done
Mm.
in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
Whether it was the right way to go. My theory is anytime the government gets involved, even if it's well intentioned, there's going to be some kind of political or economic spaghetti made somewhere that's
mhm,
For
gonna
sure.
not be the normal market outcomes. So
yeah.
Yeah. I guess, the one thing too, obviously we talked about the numbers a lot and what that all adds up to. And, for our listeners, I'm sure you, you know where my mind's at with this because I've always long said, like, if it was just about the numbers, we'd all be living in cardboard boxes and saving and investing everything. Right. And so, like, when you're thinking about these decisions, especially when you're in, retirement age, like, where are you going to be happiest? There's some people that legitimately really enjoy owning a home and fixing it up and doing all those things to it. I'm not one of those people. I still own a home, but like
mhm,
that like there's people that get a lot of enjoyment out of that, like having their own space that's theirs. That's important to them. And there's other people that don't. And I think like what I'm getting out of this discussion and some of this research is those numbers are pretty similar, right? Like when you look at renting versus buying, like
yeah,
there's not a big gap. There's not one way that
yeah,
says, hey, you should absolutely do this. If you don't, it's a major financial mistake. And I don't think it's always been that way. And so now I think it's time for people to like assess it from the standpoint of where am I actually going to be happiest at? Because,
right.
you know, we can slice it up either way. There's pros and cons of either one, but at the end of the day, they're pretty similar.
Yeah, it doesn't work out to a huge mistake one way or the other
Right.
usually. Yeah.
Right.
At least on average, you might have if you make a silly decision about buying something that was way overpriced or something that's potentially different. But the other thing too is, and we've talked about this in the past, when you're renting, you're getting something for your rent that you don't often calculate in, and that's flexibility.
Yeah.
And so, we've both had those conversations over the years with people. It's like, why would you buy a house right now? You're not sure where you want to be in 2 years, what your job is going to look like in 3 years. Let's slow our roll a little bit here, and
Yeah.
maybe if you rent for a year or two, or you've never been to that particular city, why are you going to try to buy a house there this weekend when you go visit?
Right.
That's so.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for
it's
sure.
I mean that's 100% true. And what is another really good way to look at this as well is when you are in retirement, as I've had the pleasure of sitting in a lot of our meetings over the last 9 months, is that one of the great inhibitors to a lot of people when it comes to retirement is if you were sitting on a substantial mortgage, it can be rough. Or if you're sitting on a
Hmm.
substantial rent payment, it can be really rough. But people who do own their homes when they're reaching that age or when they are retired, it significantly does reduce your monthly
Yes.
expenses, and that's a huge step in the right direction in terms of achieving financial independence and being able to actually live the life that you want and be able to retire. Because if you're sitting on a $2,500 rent payment or a mortgage payment, doesn't really matter. That
Hmm.
totally changes the equation. Like we're going to need a lot more money for you to be able to live the life that you want to live and not have to work anymore.
Yeah.
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 Well, and there's some psychology to that too, in terms of, there's some people that are a little bit more aggressive, if you will. Like, they have enough money to make that payment. It doesn't bother them. There's other people that look at that payment and go, I can't do anything because I have this huge payment, right? And so there's some psychology behind like whether or not you should pay off before retirement. So a lot of that goes into that decision as well. But you're right, like having no mortgage payment gives you a lot of flexibility, and for a lot of people it makes them feel like they can do things that they wouldn't otherwise think that they could. So
Sure. Yeah. Turns out we're emotional creatures. We're not calculators.
you are learning, young Jedi.
Yes. Yes. Our work here is done,
uh,
Nick. Yeah.
yep. I love
Um,
it. Love
good.
it. So, Cole, thank you very much. That was very informative. Appreciate you doing all that research for us. Great conversation. To our listeners, if you have questions, feel free to shoot them to us at info@srbadvisors.com. We'd be happy to pass that work along to Cole so that he can provide you an answer. Uh, with that, Dave, Cole, it has been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
guys.
Appreciate it.
This is a Zedia Media production.